Okay. If you, in addition to calling up the chat window, I recommend opening the participants window. That will show who is interested in who had something they want to say. So if you raise your hand using the little hand raising function under reactions, it'll show up in the participants window. Keep an eye on that window. It'll give you a sense of how many people are queued up to speak, and remind us all that we need to share the floor. Okay, so our topic today is, how does learning work? This is a question that I think is joined at the hip with the question, what is learning anyway? And there are many different ways of thinking about learning, and they seem to have pretty profound effects for the way we teach and educate one another. To let's say, heighten your interest in the subject, I want you to do a quick mental computation. Let's say, think back to when you were a full-time student. A full-time 40 hours a week job is about 2,000 hours over the course of a year. Let's say you were in school for 15 years, maybe might be less, might be more, but 15 years at 2,000 hours per year would be what, is my math right, 30,000 hours? And that's just in formal education. It's a round number, of course. And then, of course, many of us devote many hours to continuing to learn and educate in a deliberate effort to continue learning even after formal education ceases. So when you add that all up, it comes to a lot of hours that we spend trying to learn and become more educated. I think it's a tribute to the kind of world we live in, or the kind of world we've built, that we need to devote such extraordinary amounts of time to this essential process. And I guess the question I want to start you off with is, what percentage of the time you've spent learning would you say have been really well spent? How much of that 30,000 plus hours would you say has been either partially or wholly wasted? How much of it was inspiring and how much of it was deathly dull? And if any of your answers to the preceding questions lead you to the conclusion that we could probably be doing a better job of educating ourselves, each other, and the world's young people, ask yourself, how much more could we be doing to promote human well-being through better instructional practices? And what kind of world might we be able to build if we can rethink education, rethink learning in a way that really inspires people on a regular basis? Not, of course, that being inspirational is necessarily the be-all and end-all goal of education. Let me just mention a couple of very simple models of what learning is, and then I want to turn you loose. Think about the idea of the mind, human mind, as a blank slate. Implicit in that picture is the idea that learning is something like etching information onto a slate. That would be one way of thinking about what learning fundamentally is. The poet W.B. Yeats said, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. We might call the pail filling model the bucket model of learning. And it sounds as though Yeats is proposing something like a bonfire model of learning. I think it'll be interesting to think about whether that model fits, and if so, what it teaches us about good education. The Austrian philosopher Karl Popper said that we should use our minds like searchlights, not like buckets. Don't treat your mind as a passive knowledge receptacle. treat your mind like a searchlight, and you'll learn better. All right. Those are some very crude models of what learning is. What I'd really love to do now is open the floor and have people share with us examples of particularly inspiring moments in your own search for understanding. What thoughts do you have about how learning works? And let's open it up. If you'd have something you'd like to share, please raise your hand, and the floor will be yours. Is that Hank?
Yeah. Oh, hi. I thought I would just briefly say it from more of a personal journey. Right now I'm 74, so I've been around a while, and I think I've finally become a pretty good learner. And maybe the last 3 or 4 years, but maybe even 10 years. But I mean, I was a bright kid and did fine, but I really didn't know anything about this. So I've become open. So somebody used the word, he sees himself as a learning omnivore. So I like the term. So I've become one of those, and I'm not an academic. I'm a psychotherapist who has academic proclivities, and I speak and I write, but so I sort of, maybe I'll do more academics at this point in my life that I never really was able to do. So that's just the personal. So that's why I enjoy your meetings and the people here. And
thank you. Thank you, Hank. Yeah, learning omnivore. I've also heard the term infovore, which I think is an interesting way to.
All right, that's a new book for one of us, right?
There you go. Okay, Steve, I think you had your hand up next.
Well, I'm going to start by saying that this idea comes from your book, Andy. So for those of you who haven't read Andy's book yet, called Mental Immunity, I'm not a shill. He didn't tell me to do this. It's a fantastic book, and I recommend it most highly. But what occurred to me, Andy, was that you talk about, I think your phrase was epistemic humility as an attitude, and maybe you can say more about what you meant by that. But I think that attitude is sort of essential to being open to learning new things.
Nice. Yeah, I can't claim credit for that idea. I think that idea certainly goes all the way back to Socrates, who basically said, step one, if you want to learn anything, is realize how much you still have to learn. Because if you think you have all the answers, learning stops. So thank you, Steve. That's great. Let's see, Diane, talk to us.
Hi. Well, I'd like to just throw out a couple of ideas at the beginning. One of them is that learning and teaching, I mean, because it seemed to me that what you were talking about was at least as much about facilitating other people's learning as doing our own learning. So is there a distinction to be made there, or, should we be looking at both of them at the same time is one question. The second one, though, is just to sort of stake out a position. I think if we take the evolution of the nervous system seriously, we really can't imagine anything like a blank slate process. Okay, that's it. That's enough for now.
That's terrific, Diane. Thank you. Yeah, so just to amplify Diane's last point, I guess people who study the brain and how the brain changes as we learn now know that it's anything but a blank slate. For one thing, there seem to be certain bits of innate knowledge that are there at the start. But we also, our brains start off with way more connections than we need. And as I understand it, often prunes away some of the neural connections that aren't being used and strengthens those that are being used, which I think certainly is relevant to this question and both questions, Diane. So teaching and learning, I think those two are joined at the hip. Thank you. Nelson.
Yes, I would add to that is that learning without teaching is a selfish attitude. If you really are up to learn things, I'm 65. I'm still learning a lot of things. I'm back to after many years of managing, back to studying ethics and teaching ethics. It's a kind of sense, a particular sense that if you have something in your mind that you are putting in your knowledge, you have to transmit that. Even if you are going to write about, as you do very well, as I'm doing some as a literature a novelist, and also by teaching. So learning without teaching is a selfish attitude.
Okay, thank you, Nelson. Alex.
I just want to bring to light a sort of anecdote from my own life and my best experience with learning. It was one teacher, actually a math teacher, surprisingly enough, who, rather than just teaching us math, taught us how learning works constantly. She focused on psychology. She taught us everything from theories about myelin sheath to growth and fixed mindsets. She would break classes partway through whenever a student said, I don't understand how to do this, and explain why thinking that way was stopping them from doing that. She would break the entire class up and say, we'll continue doing this next time around a single point where someone was learning in a way she deemed unhelpful. And I think that is my best experience with learning, just because it was utterly unique. And I find people learn best when they know not just why they're learning and what they're learning, but how they're learning.
Very nice, Alex. And I'm reminded of one of the 7 principles of learning articulated in my sister's book called How Learning Works. She and her co-authors say that the best learners kind of learn to sort of monitor their own learning and adjust when the learning isn't happening well. So there's a what some psychologists call metacognition, kind of a self-monitoring going on. And if you can kind of self-monitor and tweak things when the learning ain't happening, apparently you can become a better learner. And so I think, Alex, really nice reminder that actually teaching us how to learn. I think of how much human effort is wasted because most of us never encounter a teacher like Alex's who actually got us to think about learning and helped us understand better how that process works. Sage, jump in here.
I think of learning as its objective in some ways is to create a similarity between the teacher and the learner. But I also think that we're a bit biased from formal education to think of that similarity as always being the explicit kind of didactic form, and that how my teacher thinks is how I should think about things. And I think that what we miss because of all that formal education is how important the implicit learning is. And by implicit, think of observational learning, which is watching, much of our initial learning growing up is informed by just what we see in the people around us. Kids who grow up with parents who read at home are much more interested in reading and learning how to read than just by being told about it. So it's not just this kind of abstract information accumulation. It's this learning is this integration with one's whole social and cultural environment to create a similarity.
Nice. Joseph, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. When I was in high school and college, I studied mnemonics, classic memory training.
Yeah.
And essentially, we as humans, we have the most versatile eye of any animal. We're not the best at any one particular quality, but when you put them all together, we've got the package with our eyes that no other animal can match, which means that much of our brain processing is for visual, whereas to compare to a dog, much of its brain processing is for smell, the olfactory. So the principle of most of these mnemonic systems is to convert abstract information into something that you can visualize, because our mind works better at recalling or recognizing visual information. So to the extent that can be kind of incorporated into learning, before we had printing presses, people would have to memorize.
Right.
And the way that would be done was frequent with these, classic memory systems, which are still available.
Yeah. So sometimes a visual image can help you remember, or a visual mnemonic can leverage one of the powerful parts of your brain to help you remember things.
Well, for example, and I don't want to elaborate, but if you had to memorize a 20-digit number, you would throw up your hands. But if you did it with a mnemonic, that's simple. Ah,
fascinating.
Because you've convert the abstract numbers into pictures, which you then link together. And then to memorize it, then you would kind of decode that picture back into the number.
Fascinating. Jeremy, nice to have you with us. I think you're currently muted, Jeremy, but if you can unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
No, I just want to pick up on Sage's point, because we need to think about the evolutionary function of learning. And I wanted to just mention Lalande, who's a really interesting evolutionary biologist, and he's shown that learning is absolutely ubiquitous in all kinds of species, including the fish that he studies. And if you think, well, what's the function of evolutionary function of learning? Well, it's to transmit, as it were, skills and adaptive roles from one generation to the next. What Lalande has shown is how observation, learning from others, is an incredibly efficient way of acquiring adaptive skills. You have to work everything. But there's a rider to that. It depends on environmental conditions.
Fascinating. Thank you,
Sorry,
Jeremy.
have you lost me?
We lost you momentarily, but
I haven't finished my point. The point being, oh dear. Oh well, sorry.
You want to try one last time to wrap that up?
Can you hear me? I only wanted to make the point that when the environment is changing rapidly, then self-directed learning and working things out for yourself is the most adaptive technique. Where you've got a stable environment, then observing others, observing the teachers, observing the elders, as it were, is the most efficient form of learning. So I think we need to work out in terms of our children and our pupils, what kind of environment they're living in, and fostering the relevant skills depending on the rate of change of the environment.
Interesting. So maybe a combination of I don't know if rote is the right word, but watching and imitating, learning by example in certain contexts, but also thinking for yourself and trying new strategies in other contexts. Fascinating. I think, Sage, did you want to weigh in on that point?
I get the idea there that, if what we've been doing isn't working, then certainly doing more of that is probably not the best choice. That being said, from an individual perspective, your chances of innovating something that's better than what is currently being done is very low. And so as a society, we need people to do innovation to take us to a new way of doing things. But as an individual, there's much work that shows that in times of uncertainty or when the individual costs are high, we default to the cultural knowledge, not our own intuition.
Interesting. Hank, you want to build on that?
Hi, I'm still on a track, not of my own, but in the conversation. Let's see. I've just coined a term, say I'm a good learner today. So from here, I'm just calling it, it's not new, but I'm calling it cooperative attuned learning. Okay, since we're all, anyways, when I'm talking about, especially as a therapist, but more so as a person, if you're, obviously, if you're with a patient or a group of people or a family, there are different ways of people cooperating or not cooperating, and it's your job to sort of recognize it and then help people see it and address their blind spots or their dumb spots. But I think the other thing in terms of the neuroregulation, the sort of regulating each other's body budget, as Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about, in this neuroregulation, where we're either cooperating or competing to either not learn from each other, but to be attuned to, or the metacognition of whether you're attuned and whether you rub off on each other or you're allergic to. I'm just talking about practical experience now, not the conceptual part. And I found that very important in the work and in anything you do in teaching. But so I just want to pass that along. It's the neurobiology. I don't know about the evolutionary aspect of that, but it's about cooperation or competing.
Thanks, Hank. Alex.
The idea that learning is a tool for assimilation primarily is new to me, and it is as interesting as it is terrifying. It feels incredibly wrong that is the case, but it also feels terrifyingly accurate to my experience. I don't think that should be the primary goal, because I think the world, while it can't progress without the information from the past, it should be focused on what can be the future and isn't already known, or we as a species aren't really getting anywhere. Our evolution, in whatever weird form it's going on now, has theoretically ended. So I am disturbed by what I've learned and realized, but I'm also incredibly interested in where this is going.
I'm going to take a quick stab at reducing Alex's dread here, perhaps. If you compare a newborn baby with kind of your average functioning adult, it's clear that in order to function well in a complex society, you have to absorb an enormous amount of information about just how people do things, right? And this is how you behave in this situation. This is how you behave in other situations. And a lot of that learning is can be rightly characterized as assimilation. You're kind of being assimilated into the language, into the culture you have. And that can seem sinister if it's taken to, if it becomes totalizing or totalitarian in any way. But perhaps it feels less sinister if we realize that you need to learn a whole bunch from your fellows through this passive assimilation style just to kind of function. And if it leaves room for rethinking norms, for challenging norms, for modifying norms and coming up with new ways of doing things, that still has to be kind of the exception to the overall rule. At least that's the way it looks to me at the moment. Cormac.
A really interesting conversation so far. I'm coming at this not from a formal academic place at all. What I do is I coach people in call centers to improve customer service. And the way that the success of a project is measured is whether customers are more satisfied with the conversation, and they get surveyed subsequently. So there's quite a tight loop between whatever sort of interaction you have between the manager, the person that's talking to the customer, and results. And there's two kinds of coaching that I do. One is one-to-one coaching, which is deliberative learning, where it's a reflective conversation between the coach, the learner, listening to a call, thinking about it, planning out strategies, acting on those strategies. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is group learning, where you play a call as a group, and it's more a style of assimilative learning. And what you tend to do is pick a call which is demonstrable or demonstrative of what good is and what is effective.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting things is that the people that are most engaged in the program, those that are engaged in the one-to-one program, do not correlate particularly well with those that improve most as a result of the behavior change or as a result of the customer feedback.
Interesting.
And they also are not the ones that correlate with the ones that the team leaders say that they like coaching.
That surprises me. Sorry.
Yeah, it surprises me, and it's as an instructor and as someone who is working with people who are instructing, it's difficult because we're inclined to like the people who we think we're being most effective with.
Interesting.
And where it's left me is in an uncomfortable position where I actually don't believe in teaching anymore. I think there's learning, absolutely. But what you're doing is you're creating an environment, and your job is to create the most effective environment for people to learn. But the learning's excuse my language, it's crapshoot. It's really hard to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So you got to try a lot of things.
To echo one thing,
I think we're really early.
Yeah. To echo one thing I'm hearing Cormac say, I think a big part of good teaching is kind of getting out of the learner's way, creating the right environment, and then getting out of the learner's way. I think is really part of it. You need to.
One of the things just in your introductory piece, and I'm sorry I'm talking so long, Andy, is your piece about the amount of hours that we spend learning. If you substitute the word learning for shopping, right? The amount of hours we spend shopping, how much of that time is spent acquiring goods that we really need? And how much of it is spent simply as entertainment?
Interesting.
And I think a lot of even the concepts that we get and the ideas that we get, we might feel we've learned a lot, but how much of those really affect our behavior in the world?
Fascinating. Yes. Great question. Joseph.
All right.
Joseph, still with us? I'm going to go to Diane until we hear from Joseph again. Diane?
Hi again. I was listening to the word assimilation coming from many different directions, and it put me in mind of the great psychologist and genetic psychologist, as he called himself, Jean Piaget, who had an idea of what learning was, or rather how children learn, not what they process. But he said that the process of learning is a process of attaining and maintaining equilibrium, essentially. Equilibrium between what you as a learner know or think you know, or your understanding of things, and your encounter with the external world. And so he had the idea that children, as they accumulate some kind of construction, let's say, in their minds of some particular phenomenon, they will assimilate other things to that paradigm, let's call it, to that construction, until it becomes clear that it's not adequate to actually understand what they're experiencing, in which case they accommodate to the external reality. And so he imagines that there are a series of stages. Now, there's a lot of controversy about whether it's really a stage theory or whether it's a gradual process, or, exactly at what age this happens and that happens and so forth, which I don't think is important. But the idea of the establishment and the reestablishment of equilibrium over time as you accumulate more and new encounters with the world.
You're muted, Andy.
Yeah, sorry about that. Got some background noise, so I tried to mute myself for a bit. Thank you, Diane. Your mention of the word construction, I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of people in the learning sciences now talk about learning as the construction and then testing and then the modification of models. So we're not born with a very complex model of how the world works. And if we want to navigate that world, we have to kind of create a little internal model of the world or pieces of it. Try to navigate that world with those models. And then when we bump into things or when things don't work out right, go back and revise those models and then try again. There's certainly a lot of trial and error, or perhaps
That's pure Piaget.
Oh, is that pure Piaget? Okay, fair enough. But so Piaget seems to have had it right there. But Joe Velikovsky, who many of you know from this session, who doesn't seem to have made it today, sent me an article over just this last week where he talks about a really interesting way of thinking about this. He talks about creativity as a matter of generating new forms, testing those forms, weeding out the ones that don't work, and then regeneration based on the ones that pass the tests. So generation, testing, regeneration. You'll notice the similarity here, of course, to reproduction. To the three
Evolution,
steps.
DHS.
DHS talks about this.
I'm just thinking about variability, heritability, selection. It's evolution.
It's evolution, right? Those are the three basic stages of evolution. You generate new forms, you select some of them out, and then the ones that survive get to reproduce again. So it could well be the case that learning involves a process that's fundamentally evolutionary, and that certainly seems to fit with a lot of what I'm hearing people say. Okay, Steve.
I just have to react to something Diane said before I share the comment I was originally going to make, which is I do think that Piaget's ideas of assimilation and accommodation are very, very helpful, particularly in thinking about the people you know in your lives who don't accommodate very well. They assimilate new information into their existing schemas, and so they don't do a lot of learning. The British psychologist George Kelly developed a theory called personal construct theory. He's better known, I think, in the UK than in the States. But he had a lovely phrase for this. He called it hardening of the categories, which I've always liked. But the comment I was going to make before I heard Diane talk about Piaget was simply that in the conversation so far, I think we've talked mostly about learning as a kind of linear process, where there's a teacher or a coach or a parent who somehow stimulates learning in the other. And at least in certain situations, I think it might be more fruitful to think about learning more systemically as a give and take and a circular process. The one that comes most immediately to mind for me would be my experiences as a parent. I mean, certainly I've taught my children things, but I'm also learning from them. And one of the things I'm learning is how to teach them better. So just the idea of keeping in mind that and I think that Hank, I'm also a retired therapist, and I think about therapy that way too. You know, that therapy is very much more of a circular process rather than linear.
Yeah, or would the word iterative fit with?
Yes.
There as well. Good. Jeremy. Thank you, Steve. Jeremy?
Do I need to unmute? No, I don't. Yeah, I'm still thinking about Diane's comment on Piaget, and it's interesting because I have always understood accommodation and assimilation in a slightly different way. As I understood it, Piaget said that learning is a kind of two-stage process. And the initial stage is accommodation. That's to say, he uses a kind of digestive metaphor, so that you, as it were, you put food into your stomach. It's still outside yourself, but you're very, very close to it. So you're accommodating yourself to its shape, as it were. And then you absorb it and make it yours. So that in learning, you have this sort of two-stage process of accommodation where you're kind of, in a way, just imitative learning. And then you assimilate it, it becomes part of your routine, becomes part of yourself. I think what Diane mentioned, this equilibrium concept and the ways in which fits in with the previous speaker also, a kind of stepwise approach to learning. So you have a set of schemata, which at each stage of the developmental process are constantly being sort of depassed by the next stage. I mean, the most obvious example, I think, is learning language. So a kind of, when a child acquires language, then immediately, as it were, language takes over. This new schema takes over, whereas previously they'd had to use pure gesture to communicate with others. So I think Piaget is in this conversation in lots of different ways, and thank you for bringing him in, Diane.
Sorry, unmute again. Sorry. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, I'm struck also by the analogy with what Stephen Jay Gould called punctuated equilibrium. If evolution seems to proceed through stages of relative stasis versus rapid change, and if learning is like that, where we modify our models, our mental models, that could represent the punctuations, and then when models are working pretty well for us, you get a relative stasis, or you just assimilate or become more and more attached to the model until eventually the model reaches its limits and you have to modify it again. Sage.
I want to add another wrinkle to this idea of updating your models based on what works. What works? I think we're subtly alluding to the idea, this idealized version of learning is that we'll get to the truth, we'll get to the bottom of it. The true reality of what we know is what will come out. That'll be the best ideas. But there's this interesting distinction of, I guess, what you would call factual reality, which would be the former that I just mentioned. And then perhaps you could call the other adaptive or practical reality. And that's where you kind of get fuzzy with the social construction, and that what works, the best ideas, might be basically going along with what is around you, because that works for everybody. You can have all these adaptive fictions about why you do these things, and they could have nothing to do with the real impacts. And yet that's the best. If you think that way, you'll be much more successful than if you rail against the crowd like Galileo. So maybe, how do we get out of those if they're keeping us away from the truth? That's in some ways, I guess, the role of the academy.
Love the question, but I will point out that we remember Galileo and we don't remember all of those who persecuted today. So if the game is all about leaving a legacy, Galileo was a winner, at least in my book. Hey, Chris, I saw you put your hand like this a while back. That wasn't an attempt to get my attention, was it? Yeah. Do you care to share your thoughts, or you're good? You're good. All right. Let's see, Hank. I need to unmute, Hank.
Yeah, I'll read this quote, but in a moment, it's from Robert Oppenheimer. He says, "There must be no barriers to freedom of inquiry. There's no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any question, to doubt any assertion, to seek for any evidence, to correct any errors." Okay, so it sort of probably takes us a little bit back to your book, Andy, but I think this might be, I'm bringing it up partially because it could be a topic like, what the hell goes on that we can't do this, that all of us don't do it, or only some of us do it, or some of us do it half-assed, or some people are against doing it. I mean, it's a whole bigger thing, but that's what's coming up for me as we all talk about this.
Yeah, I think that Oppenheimer quote captures beautifully well the sort of the scientific attitude, but you might also call it just the attitude of the learner, of the lifelong learner, right?
Yeah, the inquirer.
Of the inquirer.
Yeah,
thank you. Alex.
I think for a while we've been dancing around the term cognitive dissonance, and that's a really important part of this, because models, in a way, harden over time. the longer you let someone hold on to a model comfortably, the more, at least from my experience, the more set it will be in their head and the harder it will be for that model to change. So I think part of learning is discomfort. And if we let people be comfortable, that gets in the way of learning.
Wow, Alex, that was beautifully wise. And you would never guess that Alex is what, 15, guys, from the depth of his insight there. Kudos,
17,
Alex.
but
Oh, 17. Okay. Well, I wouldn't have guessed 17 either, but really nicely done. I love what you had to say there. Sage, you have a hand up. Is that a vestige or are you ready to go again?
Vestige.
So here's a question. Do our schools need to be redesigned? Does our educational system need to be overhauled? I'll make a preliminary case for answering that question in the affirmative. Seems to me, so think about it this way, right? We take kids starting at what, age 5 or 6, we put them in rooms with other kids their same age. And let me pause to stress the unwisdom of that. I was once at a playground watching my kids just play and kind of learn how to navigate the playground equipment. What my 2 sons were doing was watching intently what the older kids were doing and then following them around and trying to do what the older kids were doing. It was almost like they were programmed to do this. They'd each of them almost just instinctually picked out a kid 1 or 2 years older and tried to keep up. So if that's the way you learn, by trying to follow somebody who's a little bit more mature, then the absolute worst thing you can do is lock kids away in rooms full of kids their own age. And of course, don't get me started on how often classroom learning becomes passive, or how often it becomes, the teacher distributing information that the students are expected to internalize and remember. I wish I had back all of the time I spent sitting in a class resenting being treated like a knowledge receptacle. And I'm captivated by stories of teachers who remake their classrooms into these just lively environments where kids get to try stuff and do stuff and make stuff and learn by trial and error. And I can't help but wonder whether we would be doing our children a huge service by remaking our nation's schools into environments where that sort of thing happens routinely rather than only occasionally. Steve?
Did I unmute? I did. I'm just going to push back a little bit, Andy, on your idea about maybe a multi-age classroom would be a preferable setting. And there's probably research on this that I have no idea, and it probably contradicts what I'm about to say. Just 2 points. One is that although all the children in a classroom are the same age, there's quite a bell curve of abilities depending upon whatever it is that is being taught. So there are children that are close to a child in age, but who are more advanced. And they can still look to that child, in terms of vicarious and observational learning. And the other comment is that one of the worst things I think you can do in trying to teach a kid something is ask him to do a task which he's sort of developmentally not ready to do. And I've seen this sometimes with young parents that don't really know a lot about child development. And they sort of have unrealistic demands that a 3-year-old should be able to have table manners that are equivalent to an adult's, just unrealistic. A child's not going to be able to do that. And when you ask a child to do something that sort of developmentally outstrips them, you're going to create frustration. And frustration can be really a death knell to openness to learning. So Just thoughts that popped into my head as you were talking about the playground experience.
Yeah, love it, Steve. Thank you. That's great. And Steve's second point certainly jibes well with another of the principles of outlined in my sister's book that I mentioned. Basically, almost all learning is a matter of trying to assimilate new information into the information one already has, or attach new knowledge to the knowledge one already has, figure out where it fits in to build on. In other words, no learning occurs in a vacuum. Learners always bring something, bring a background, bring previous knowledge to the table, and you somehow have to connect the new with the old, the unfamiliar with the familiar, so that real learning happens. I don't think just dropping facts randomly into a mind produces understanding. And I think good teachers understand this instinctively and pay close attention to the developmental needs of students, and expose them to kind of a challenge, but a manageable challenge, and then support their effort, the students' efforts to meet that challenge, so that they can learn. And there has to be kind of a fruitful degree of difficulty. Too easy, not enough learning happens. Too hard, and they get frustrated and stop learning also. Thanks, Steve. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I was a teacher for many years, and one of the things that struck me, you may already have mentioned it, I joined the meeting late, I'm sorry if that's the case, but the idea that exams and how unlikely the sorts of changes you are talking about could occur within the system where the currency for a good education is an exam result, a set of exam results. And it seems to me that even though I taught for many years, I have to confess to being unsure about how I would go about it, but it does feel fundamentally like that is the crux of that is what stops a lot of things that could be changed in education.
Yeah, I think we think about what exams communicate to students about what's important. If when they're subjected to educational routines where testing is prominent, you're basically telling students that you're expecting them to remember stuff.
Yeah.
But we now have this thing called Google that remembers stuff for us. So why are we still teaching kids to remember stuff, right? Why don't we instead reallocate classroom time to, I don't know, project work or problem solving, or just give every student access to a browser and put them on a challenging problem, let them work in groups, and who needs to? I'm told, this might be apocryphal, but I'm told that Einstein was once asked for his phone number, and he said, well, let me look it up for you. And he went to a phone book and he found the guy his phone number. He said, I never waste mental storage space on stuff I can outsource to another thing. I don't know if that's true, but I like this.
Yeah.
So listen, guys, we're almost at the end of the hour. And as always, we're going to collectively choose our topic for next month. We hope you'll join us again on Thursday, August 19th. Hope you'll make a note of that. Same time, same bat time, same bat channel. So 12 Eastern, Thursday, August 19th. Sage, that's good, right? That'll work. Okay. I'm going to, as usual, suggest a few topics, and then we will vote on them, and the highest vote getter will become our discussion topic for next week. Before I do that, Steve reminded me, and I'm grateful to him for this, that this view of life, which pays Sage's salary and pays me a small stipend to do this kind of thing, is reliant on donations so that we can continue doing what we do. I think this view of life does marvelous work. I hope you'll consider a gift to this view of life, and should you see fit to mention or earmark that for Examined Lives, that too would be much appreciated. Please make a habit of doing that every now and again when inspired to do so. Okay, for next time, here are some possible topics. I'm going to walk through a few of them. We'll come back after you've heard them all, and you can cast votes for as many as you like. I think Steve has a topic he'd like to propose. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, I do. So the topic is lies and deception. And it was stimulated by an article I read last week on the Daily Beast by David Rothkopf. And I'm going to read you a sentence or two from the article, and then a couple of discussion questions I think we could have. He wrote, "We are all brought up to believe howling absurdities, ridiculous impossibilities, and insupportable malarkey from our very first moments on Earth. We have massive lie delivery systems that are the core institutions of our society. And we have created cultural barriers to even questioning fabrications, which are the most deserving of skeptical scrutiny." And what he does with that is he says basically that that's why so many people in our society, in American society, are prone to believe the big lie, because the ground is well prepared. We're lied to all our lives. And I would add to that litany, we also lie to ourselves all the time as well. So some of the questions we could address are, why do human beings lie? Why is lying so pervasive? I had written down, do lies have utility, if not validity? And Sage earlier had talked about adaptive fictions, and I think that's exactly that. And are lies necessary? If we do a thought experiment about living in a world in which nobody lied to anybody ever, including to your partner and yourself, would that really be such a paradise? So the topic of lies and deception would be my suggestion.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. I love it. Let's see. Nelson and Hank, are you indicating that you like that topic? I'll come back for a vote. You can cast your votes after you've heard each of them. Lovely job, Steve. I think that would be a marvelous.
I won't be offended if you don't like it and don't vote for it. So don't worry about that.
Okay. Well, I think it's a timely topic too, given the pervasiveness of the big lie about the 2020 election here in America, at least. Okay, topic number 2, and just quick question, Nelson, were you hoping to nominate a topic as well?
No, I would say that lying, talking about lies and without talking about truth is of course half of the issue. But what it is a quite interesting thing to discuss about what is lie, what is truth, how things can change in the through history, from truth to the big lies, and how the future is a big lie or is a big truth as long as you develop it.
I hear you, and I think all of those.
I love the topic, but I would add that lies and truth. Lying.
I hear you. Yes, and that I think that can be on the table as well. If choose.
But I would love the topic.
Okay, all right. A second topic we might discuss: what is life anyway? What is it that distinguishes living things from non-living things? And what qualities must a thing possess to count as alive? Third topic, is speciesism like racism? So is privileging our species morally comparable to privileging our race? All right. We can take one more topic from the floor, if you can be brief. Anybody like to? Joseph, was that an effort to? Would you like to throw a topic out? You need to unmute, Joseph.
Sorry. How about issues with the scope and implementation of engineering ethics and/or research ethics, and how evolutionary psychology might have more practical application to what many of us are doing in our vocations?
Excellent. Well, I think I missed one word there when Zoom glitched. What kind of research ethics?
Research and engineering ethics.
Research and engineering ethics. Okay, that'll be topic number 4. Okay, time for a vote, guys. All right, so please use the hand raise feature under the reactions button to register your vote. If for some reason your version of Zoom doesn't allow it, wave your hand vigorously so Sage can record it. All right, all those vote for as many of these topics as you'd like. Topic number 1, lies and deception. Okay, got it, Sage?
Yep.
Okay, hands down, please. Topic number 2, what is life anyway? Oh, come on, not a single vote, guys. Oh, Steve, you're stealing all my thunder here, buddy. Okay, topic number 3, is speciesism like racism? Okay, and thank you, hands down. And finally, research and engineering ethics. I do like the suggestion of this one since it relates to something many of us do. Okay, I think we have a clear winner. Lies and deception it is. I'll put together a blurb for Sage. Sage will send it out to all of you. I hope you'll join us again next month. And I want to thank everybody for their thoughtful contributions to today's discussion. Nice seeing you all again.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody.